Welcome to Neon Cobra. Let's kick into it. All right, we're going to do week 3 of our common estimate browsers. So we're going to do a slight change. We're going to build off some of the stuff we've already learned, and we're going to create a similar environment to maybe the large QuickBooks one we did last week. So what we're going to do this week is we're going to build an environment that uses more platform services, and it's going to leverage SQL because tends to catch people up when they're building in Azure. SQL itself, on premise, you have the ability to do your standard user CAL models, and that doesn't work in Azure. You have to go to core-based licensing. Now, your options to pay for that really are either hourly through Microsoft, and I'll show you how to do that, or you bring your own license in the form of software assurance or subscription-based licensing. Now, I've got videos on this, so I will include those in the description if you're curious about this, but I want to show you how to actually build this in the calculator itself. So switching over to the calculator, same thing as before. You're going to want to log in. And, as an example, I've got my 2 previous builds I've done here, right? We've got the 5 user and the 25 user. So if you want to open it up and work off that, that is fine. If you're going to follow along, we're going to start a brand new one today. So first thing we're going to do, we're going to create an environment. It's going to be, we'll say 50 users at this point. We'll kind of incrementally ramp up. And the line of business is going to be a CRM application. For sake of clarity, we'll say like a Sage 300 as an example, right? This is where we start to get into the CRM platforms and applications that require SQL as a backend. So now we're bringing in other licensing and services. Now we are going to pretend that this is a brand new company, right? I'm setting a lot of contingencies and areas in here that may not make a lot of sense, but there's reasons for this. So because it's a brand new company, we don't have history, we don't have leftover or tech debt, if you will, or licensing to bring up to the cloud. We're going to start a brand new environment. I'm going to opt to use Active Directory domain services, or Entra domain services as it's called. So if you've been looking for Active Directory, it's likely not going to show up when you do this, right? You'll get nothing. But if you do Entra, right, you'll get Microsoft Entra ID, formerly Azure AD. So we're going to select this item. So as we come down, we'll do the same thing we did before. We'll name this and we'll call it 50 user, we'll say Sage 300, right? Now we've got our Entra ID, which this is like our premium P1 or P2. There are versions of this, but buried within this SKU is Entra Domain Services, which is essentially Microsoft's platform service domain controller. It'll provide your role-based access control, your NTFS permissions, but you don't have to look after a virtual machine anymore. Now, there are some limitations to this. One, you can't transfer into it. It's generally net new. It auto-integrates into Entra ID. So essentially it establishes that cloud connect that you may have had to do manually in the past. But as a result, it does not treat itself as a hybridized environment. So if you're doing some form of authentications that require hybrid identities, this will not allow for that. So assuming we're just trying to get a role-based access control, a domain-controlled environment with baseline items, and we're likely going to be managing a lot of this in Intune as well, Entra Domain Services is a great place to start. So with that, again, the changes we need to do, make sure it's in the correct region. This will matter, right? VMs and everything and cost. Make sure it's in the correct currency. So I'm going to price mine in Canadian. And come down. So the first thing we want to do is actually we want to blow out these P1, P2 SKUs. Realistically, you should be getting these from like your business premium, your E3, your E5s, or standard Entra SKUs. You do have the ability to do it on entire directories, but that's more for your P1s, your P2s, and things like that when you're doing like business connects and such. So I wouldn't really include those. It does muddy the price. But you will notice down here the Entra domain services. So this is what we want to be modifying. Now we are going to set down here, once it loads, there we go, standard, right? Your 3 tiers, more or less, are kind of graded around enterprise deployments. So if we're looking at, say, standard, you're going to be more than enough for your general environment. Enterprise is when you start getting enterprise. So drop it down to standard, set your hours to 744. And this will be our domain controller. And we can even call this just domain services if you wish. So we now have our domain controller. So the next thing we do is we need to create an application server. So we'll do virtual machines, right? And we'll call this Sage 300. So working through this, same as before, we'll choose our region, right? You notice it refreshes, changes all the pricing. It's going to be Windows. Now this is where we determine whether we have SQL or not. So this is going to include SQL as an individual line item based on the quantity of cores we choose. So we'll choose SQL Server. Now you are going to find that the cost rockets up almost immediately. So SQL is not cheap. When you move into Azure, you are now subject to core-based licensing. So even a 2-user shop to a 1,000-user shop, you're licensing based on cores, which can be rather costly. Now, some applications may have licensing built in. You will generally need to validate with the vendor whether their stuff is valid in Azure, because if they're doing a standard user CAL model behind the scenes, you will not be compliant when you move up, and you may still have to pay for that. If you do runtime stuff, you may be applicable to leverage the licensing around that, but that's getting pretty deep in the weeds, so we're not going to focus too much. So assuming we're using an app server that requires SQL, we'll come in here, we'll choose SQL, it will add this item down here with the cost. Now, by default, it's opted for this 2-core 8 gig, right? Gives us the enterprise price. So the first thing we want to do is change your licensing down to standard. We now need to determine the type of virtual machine we want to run this on. So this will really come down to your system requirements, right? If your vendor is telling you you need X, then you have to provide X, at least to start for the install. When they're done, you can go see performance and maybe adjust those numbers after. So let's say, for example, I need 4 cores and 32 gigs of memory, right? Initially, I might go D4S, which is a really good option, except you're going to find here I don't have that ability, right? If I go D8S, which would give me 32 gigs, it double my core count, which would then double. So that's my 4. And then a D8S, it's going to double my licensing costs, right? Core count is very important in Azure because everything is based on the how many cores there are from a licensing standpoint. Even the operating system licensing went up. So then you would come to an E4S, right? That would allow us then to maintain the 4 cores and do their memory where we would require. Now, let's say for sake of argument, we need more memory. There are these constrained virtual machines that you can choose that will actually be 8 cores under the hood, but Microsoft is constraining or disabling 4 of the cores. This allows you to get a little bit more granular with the control over your virtual machines, which is very important. So if you are running at 32 gigs of memory and then just like, oh, we're running out, we need more memory. If your first instinct is to go to the E8S, you're going to double all your licensing requirements, right? If you don't need to touch your CPU, you can stay within the same realm, but then go to an E8-4. And that dash nomenclature essentially is saying, look, we're taking this and we're bringing it down. So a lot of what you'll find is all this does is it impacts the actual memory allocation at this point. And then your licensing allocation goes back down to its previous amounts. So for this though, 4-core 32 is a fairly standard fare. So we'll set that there. Now, being cost conscious, we're going to lock in for long term. We know that this environment's likely not to adjust too often. So we will levy our 3 years. And for the licensing, my recommendations, right? If we're talking about bang for your buck, buy the Windows operating system licensing, right? This is 1 or 3 year term. Pay hourly for SQL Server. So reasoning for this, the cost to buy the Windows Server licensing, right, at this time is about $966, right, give or take Canadian. So with that in mind, 8 cores for $966 by month 5 of a 36-month term, because that's what that 36-month term, you've paid for itself, right? So it makes sense to buy that. Now, for SQL at this time, and I suspect it'll be even worse when 2025 comes out because they tend to have price increases, your break-even point for 4 cores is month 32 of 36. It is almost $13,000 to buy 4 cores of SQL-based licensing. On average, it saves you $50 a month, right? That's just general numbers working at this time. So with that in mind, unless they have a large capital expense, use it or lose it kind of budget, right? You'll see this sometimes in not-for-profit, government entities, things that try to budget on a yearly. it's going to be very hard to try to move them to an operational expense model, being like, hey, no more server purchases, move up to Azure. Oh, but by the way, we need $13,000 in licensing, right? It's very difficult to make that happen. So more often than not, I will leave this as license included. Microsoft will charge you hourly. So if you shut this down, this pauses for the SQL licensing. So you can install your own version of SQL, bring whatever CD keys you want, but for compliance's sake, you have to install the IaaS agent, the SQL IaaS agent that monitors that SQL and then reports back consumption into Azure, which will then turn these meters on. So if you've ever migrated from on-premise or done a manual ISO level install or EXE install in the operating system and never connected it back to Azure, technically you're in licensing breach, right? Because you are not reporting and you do not have the most valid licensing for that. So something to keep in mind. So with this, we'll set our operating system disks. I always like to use this section as operating systems. And then we are going to add a secondary disk for the SQL data. So we'll go SQL data, set the region. Now set it to premium. SQL tends to churn a lot, so we do not want to get shocked by storage transaction fees. So you'll put the SQL data on that, and then we'll double that out and we'll do SQL logs, right? We'll split the data and logs just for safety's sake. So that'll be our host, right? We've got our Sage 300 data. We've got SQL running in, paid for on there. We've got our domain controller via the form of the platform services. Now, another thing we're going to add to this, another platform service is going to be Azure Files. So let's say there's our large file structure that goes with this as well, right? You got client data, you're storing it now. Instead of building another environment or another server to host this on, we're going to leverage the Azure platform services. We'll go into Azure Files. So in this case, because it is general usage files, you have a couple of options, right? You can go provisioned one, version 2. I'll have previous videos on those, as well as this stuff's constantly changing, or pay as you go. The pay as you go would be, depending on when you looked at how this has functioned for the longest time, it's consumption-based modeling, right? You choose your access tiers of hot, cool, or transaction optimized. If you need premium, you change your data tiers and pricing structure changes. But for this, we're going to stay within those. And then you can, pay for what you use. The other option is you can go to a provision state where you say exactly how much you want in there. It doesn't grow natively. You have to set your sizes. And then you can control IO and everything. So for most organizations, I would say the pay-as-you-go is a great place to start, because in that way you can get a better feel. You might have a lot of data, but it might be a lot of dead data, right? No one's accessing it. So in this hypothetical environment, we're going to do hot tier, right? Bunch of PDFs, maybe the occasional Excel spreadsheet. There's a lot of historical data for clients you've been servicing for years. We're going to say we have, at this time, 2 terabytes of data, and we're not going to do any of the use snapshots and stuff. So I would have covered this in previous videos. I like to split out a lot of my line items into their own items, right? You can bury snapshots in almost everything you do. You can do bandwidth in almost everything you do, but I do like to showcase it outside of that so you understand where your cost buckets are. So we've got our 2 terabytes, no snapshots. We're not going to reserve. The idea is we want this to grow. Now here's another field here called metadata. Now this is really the backend information. This tends to be bloated. I always like to do maybe a third of total data into this, which even then is probably a lot, right? This is just something I like to pad a little bit because it's really hard to know the size of your metadata, right? So we'll leave that there. Now storage transactions, again, this is another one that is very hard to predict. So I like to just add 100 million to each of them, right? This is a 100 times 10,000. So what you will find is, a million transactions. You will find that most times these will barely be touched unless there's large churn or problems in the environment where maybe you're churning the data constantly. This is really one of the reasons why we don't use standard disks for our databases as well, because they're constantly being indexed. All right. And because we are only using hot tier, we don't get any data transfers and we won't be syncing, right? And now we have, so we'll call this file storage. So 2 terabytes of hot transactional files for 127. So final items we'll add to this. We'll add our backups. We'll add an Azure firewall, right? We're not going to bring our own appliance this time. We're going to use some of the native firewall services. We'll add an IP address. And we'll get this finalized. So for backups, actually, sorry, one last thing we'll have to add to this virtual desktop. So we'll come back up here. We'll collapse everything. We'll reshuffle. Again, we kind of walked through this in the past. And we'll build 50 user AVD, right? Remember, a lot of applications like Sage, as an example, does not function over VPN. So something like a virtual desktop pool is going to be required. So we're going to come back in. We'll choose our workload type, right? Again, heavy assumes 2 users per vCPU. Let's just say they're power users, right? 1 for 1. They're doing a lot of transactions, a lot of clients. We want to give them a lot of functionality. We will give them 50 users. We will come down and we'll choose our commonly E8S v5, right? I'd like the 864. So this will give 8 users per host, on average 8 gig of memory per user. And we are going to actually work to scale some of this. So this is where you got to get into some of the nuance and the configuration within Azure to auto scale up and down, or leverage platforms like Nerdio Manager for MSP to automate this section for you. But what you'll see is one host will stay on 24/7, so 510 hours during off peak, and then the remaining hours of the month, so your 9 to 5, 7 will power on. So we have 7 hosts serving 50 users. Now, each of those hosts will only need 128 gigs of memory, or hard drive space, which is fine, right? This is just operating system disk and applications. Profile storage will be down here. So I'm going to give a terabyte of profile storage. That's on average 20 gigs per user. And there are ways and things you can do to bring this down as required. Now, bandwidth, general rule of thumb, I like to do 5 gigs per user. Now, that is like heavy graphics, but just in case, right? So maybe someone's streaming YouTube, maybe someone's, bringing a lot of data out of the environment. We're trying to average across. So at 50 users at 5 gigs a piece, I'm going to give, let's see here, 250 gigs of outbound bandwidth a month, right? That should be more than enough to account for 50 users. And your first 100 gigs is free. So that'll be our AVD component. Now for backups, we've got 2 versions. We've got VM, right? Now, because we're platforming a lot of these services, the only virtual machine we have to protect now is this Sage 300. So we can say, in this case, we have 128 gig OS disk, and then we have 256. So we've got about 756 gigs. We'll say 750 gigs, just a nice round number, of data to be covered. We'll set our general policies there. We will set zone redundant storage, and then this will give us the ability to back up the VM. Now, SQL is running on this system. So maybe I want context and SQL aware backups. So I will duplicate out that Azure backups. I will come down here, change it to SQL, change the type to SQL Server on Azure. And now we only have 250 gigs, 512 gigs, right? We don't need to worry about the OS drives. We set our basic resiliency and policies. We set our zone redundancy. And now we have SQL aware backups. So we can go down and do MDF, LDF, log restores. Now, the third thing we need to account for in this is going to be profiles, right? We are storing the AVD profiles in FS Logics on Azure files. Now, that is included in the AVD line item. So we will come in here, choose Azure files, and we had, in this case, what did I put in there? Let's take a quick look. A terabyte. It's 20 gigs a piece, right? So we will back up their profiles, general backup. We'll set our performance tier to premium, our resiliency to zone, and you can choose whatever kind of profile retention policies you desire here, and we'll save that there. Now, finally, we have our Azure firewall. So depending on your requirements, right, we'll set our region and you set your tier. We're going to start with basic, right? They don't need web filtering. They just need general protection. So we'll start with the basic tier. Now you can jump in to see what this would actually include. in the white pages, so I won't dive into that right now. But we do want to set it to 744 hours. Reminder, that's a 31-day month. That is the most this will cost in a month, right? As many hours as you can get. As far as data processed, we'd included roughly 250 gigs, right? So we can just put 250 gigs there just to kind of give us a baseline. Now, finally, as far as IP address, this is just for the firewall. Any additional services, they are generally pretty minor in their requirements, but I do like to include them. Okay. Now, this is probably, quite honestly, a little bit more robust than you'd likely do for an environment like this. The key points to take away from this is really going to be using some of the platform services. And by doing that, you're going to start seeing the actual reduction of management, right? For you as an MSP, the only thing you're really looking after at this point is that Sage box. You have your RMM tools on there, you've got your MDRs, all that stuff runs on that. The Azure virtual desktops are kind of ephemeral. So if you lock those down in a specific way and you have a solid golden image to reference, every time there's an issue, you just rebuild the session host. All systems are being protected using Azure backups. You've got redundancy and resiliency down to the SQL application consistent backups. You are then leveraging the Azure firewall, which then can be put into Azure Sentinel or other services within the Azure ecosystem if you need to expand your security footprint. So the only thing you have to bring to this table at this point is the licensing for that one box, right? The 966 to cover that Sage pricing. So this brings us, we'll save this to 3678, right? That is the rough cost per month, likely a little bloated. And if we do, we divide this on cost per user as an example, right? We had 50 users. It's less than $75 a month to have your users in Azure fully platformed. Your management aspect goes down because a lot of these items are maintained and managed from a hardware security level within Azure. You just have to service the end user experience and some of the Sage data in there. So this one is probably a little bit more bloated in reality, right? You'll likely be leveraging things like your own firewall appliance. You probably have less data. If you can get their profile space down, all these numbers kind of adjust accordingly. But more often than not, this is a great place to start, and you can really drive down additional cost optimizations around the AVD side by scaling more aggressively using tools like Nerdio Manager just to keep things up and running and consistent. So with that, save it, share it out. You have the ability to provide these links at any point and reference them back. I'll keep this link in the comment section so you can come in and make adjustments. If you have any comments, questions, or other design builds you'd love to see, just let me know. And with that, we'll catch you next time.